All right, let's dive into the world of landscape painting. We're taking a deep dive into a YouTube tutorial by artist Alan Dixon, and I'm excited to explore all the cool techniques he uses.
And you specifically wanted to focus on the techniques he uses, right?
Yes, I'm fascinated by how he creates such realistic landscapes, especially those amazing skies and water reflections.
Well, you're in for a treat. What I find really cool is how Dixon focuses on oils in this tutorial and walks us through using mediums. He talks about liquid, especially with white paint.
Oh, yeah, I remember that.
It's like his secret weapon for making the paint flow smoothly and dry faster.
So that's how he gets those soft blends. He uses mineral spirits too, right?
Exactly. You can think of mineral spirits as your blending buddy.
Okay.
Perfect for creating those soft transitions between colors. Lichen is more about the paint itself, while mineral spirits are all about how the colors interact on the canvas.
So it's like having different tools for different effects. Now, I'm really curious about his color choices. The way he captures the nuances of nature is incredible.
It's not just about picking pretty colors, he's very deliberate about it.
Yeah.
Notice how he doesn't just use greens for distant trees, he grays them down.
I was wondering about that.
This subtle shift in color instantly pushes those trees back, creating depth you can almost feel.
That's a great point. It's like they're fading into the distance.
Yeah.
I never thought about using color that way. Now, what about brushes? He seems to have quite a collection.
Oh, he does. He's got brushes for every occasion. And he mentions a few favorites like filbert brushes for blending and softening edges. You'll see him using them constantly. He even name drops a couple of brands, Rosemary & Co. and Da Vinci, as ones he trusts.
It's like finding that perfect pen that just flows. Speaking of flow, his sky techniques are mesmerizing. They look so effortless, but I know there's a lot of technique involved.
Absolutely. Dixon builds the sky in layers, starting with soft gradients
Right.
and then adding texture with what he calls, and I love this, dancing brush strokes.
Dancing brush stroke.
It's all about creating that natural, almost cloud-like feel.
I love that. You can almost see the brush moving across the canvas.
Right.
And wait, doesn't he use a cloth too?
You've got a sharp eye. He uses a cloth to further soften those transitions in the sky, almost like he's gently erasing any harsh lines.
Now, water reflections.
Mm.
That's where I always struggle.
Mm-hmm.
I'm eager to see how he tackles those.
Well, this is where observation is key. Dixon emphasizes reflecting not just the shapes, but the colors and tones of the sky and trees in the water.
Right.
It's about capturing the whole scene, not just mirroring the shapes.
That makes so much sense. I notice he talks a lot about creating depth in the landscape, using things like color saturation, value, and edge sharpness. What exactly does he mean by that?
He's constantly playing with how intense and bright his colors are
Okay.
and how defined the edges are. For instance, things closer to us appear brighter, more saturated, and have sharper edges.
I see.
It's almost like a visual trick to fool our eyes into seeing depth.
That's clever. And I remember him saying that he likes to leave some of the canvas texture visible, especially in the sky and foliage.
Exactly.
It's like he's embracing the imperfections, which I find really refreshing.
It adds to that organic feel. And speaking of getting hands-on, remember when he uses his fingers to blend and add texture to the foliage and water?
I was surprised by that.
Yeah.
You mean you don't always need a fancy brush?
Right. Sometimes the best tool is right at your fingertips. It's a great reminder that art is about finding what works for you, experimenting, and not being afraid to get a little messy.
I love how much this tutorial is about mindset, not just mechanics.
Yeah.
Now, how does he create that sense of mist and distance? It's almost magical.
It is magical, but he actually has a very methodical approach.
Yeah.
He desaturates the colors in the background, making them paler and less vibrant, and softens the edges so they blend into the atmosphere.
So it's like they're slowly disappearing into the distance. He even gives specific color mixes to get that misty effect, which is really helpful. Now, let's talk about grasses, because it seems like Dixon really gets into the weeds with that.
Yeah.
No pun intended.
He certainly does. And he's not afraid to try different brushes to get the effect he wants. He uses a sword brush for bolder strokes and a rigger brush for those delicate, wispy details.
Interesting.
He even mentions that he's not a fan of fan brushes. Can you believe it?
Really?
It's interesting to hear an artist's preferences, right?
Yeah, it is.
It's like they have their own set of go-to tools, just like any other craft.
I can definitely relate to that. Everyone has their favorites. It's fascinating how he uses those dancing brushstrokes again when painting the grasses. They
Yeah.
look so alive.
He really wants to capture that sense of energy and life. And speaking of connection, he's very mindful of how the grasses are reflected in the water, ensuring they flow seamlessly with the rest of the scene.
He even adds a slight ripple effect to those reflections, which adds another layer of realism. It's like he's thought of every little detail.
And that attention to detail is what brings it all together. Remember when he talks about the importance of variance in the grasses? He doesn't just paint a solid mass of green.
Oh, right.
He uses different tones and saturations to make it look more natural.
He uses a technique called dry brushing to add those delicate details and highlights. He also uses something called scumbling, which is a way of dragging the paint across the surface to create a broken, textured effect. I've always struggled with that one.
It definitely takes practice. And sometimes he even uses a palette knife to create those textured patches of grass, adding another layer of visual interest.
It's incredible how many techniques he uses, and he makes it look so easy.
Well, remember, he's a professional. But that shouldn't discourage us. He's sharing his knowledge so we can learn and grow as artists. And what I really appreciate is how he doesn't shy away from showing those oh bother moments that we all experience.
It's so relatable. Even professionals have those moments.
Exactly. He's not afraid to make mistakes or adjust his approach. It's a reminder that art isn't about being perfect, but about problem solving, experimenting, and enjoying the journey.
He even adds those unexpected pops of color, like that bright red grass in the foreground, just to break up the monotony and add visual interest.
It's like he's saying, don't be afraid to experiment and have fun, which is a great note to end this section on.
I completely agree. We've covered so much ground already, from color choices to brush techniques and that refreshing artist's mindset he embodies.
It's been a whirlwind of techniques, and there's more to come. We'll be back in a flash to dive even deeper into Dixon's process. Welcome back. We were just talking about Dixon's way of painting grasses, and it got me thinking about how he really focuses on capturing their essence, not getting bogged down in every single blade.
Yeah, that makes sense, especially for a whole field of grass. How does he actually go about simplifying those shapes?
He uses a bunch of different brush strokes. You'll see him using a rigger brush for those delicate flicks and a sword brush for bolder strokes.
Okay.
It's almost like he's finding the rhythm of the grasses and putting that onto the canvas.
It's like dancing with a brush. I notice he also changes how hard he presses the brush. Is that how he gets those subtle shifts in value and texture?
You got it. It's like he's sculpting those forms with the brush, creating highlights and shadows that give the grasses, dimension.
Okay, yeah.
And movement.
That makes sense. And the way he uses dry brushing to add those wispy details and highlights, it almost looks like he's sketching with paint.
Yeah. And don't forget about the palette knife.
Oh, right.
He scrapes on paint to create those rough patches of grass, which makes the surface more interesting to look at.
I love those little touches. It's a good reminder that you don't always need a ton of fancy brushes.
Right. Sometimes simple is best. And remember when he talked about letting some of the underpainting show through?
Mm-hmm.
It adds such a cool layered effect.
It's like he's letting the history of the painting show through, giving it depth and complexity. It kind of reminds me of those ancient cities where you can see, different layers of history built on top of each other.
That's a great way to put it. Now, Dixon really stresses understanding how light affects color in a landscape. It sounds technical, but I'm curious to hear how he explains it.
Yeah.
He makes it very practical. He explains how warm colors, like yellows and reds, bring things forward, while cool colors, like blues and grays, push them back into the distance.
Okay.
It's all about creating that illusion of depth and atmosphere.
It's like a push and pull effect with the colors. And he's constantly adjusting those colors, right?
Yeah.
Adding a touch of blue to cool down a green, or a dab of yellow to warm up a gray.
Exactly. It's like it's conducting an orchestra of color.
That's a great visual. And speaking of harmony, I'm always impressed by how well he blends those reflections in the water. He really takes the time to make sure the colors and tones match what's going on above.
He doesn't want those reflections to just be, mirror images. He wants them to feel real, almost like a separate world under the surface.
Yeah.
He even considers how water distorts and softens those reflections,
Right.
adding little ripples for movement.
It's amazing how he pays attention to those little details. Okay, let's talk mist, because he creates such a convincing illusion of it in his landscapes.
Yeah. Creating mist is all about using those elements we talked about earlier, remember? Color saturation, value, and edge sharpness. He makes the colors in the background paler and less vibrant and softens the edges so they blend into the atmosphere.
So it's like they're fading into the distance, yeah.
Yeah.
He uses those same ideas to create depth in the foreground grasses too, right?
Exactly. He makes some of those greens brighter and more defined, so those closer blades feel like, they're reaching out to you.
Yeah.
And those dancing brush strokes, he uses those here too, creating those random organic textures that make the grasses look, so real.
Like they're swaying in the breeze. One thing I find really inspiring is how he encourages experimentation. And he even like breaks from tradition sometimes,
Mhm.
like when he uses his fingers to blend the paint.
Oh, yeah. Or when he uses a cloth to soften those cloud edges or add texture to the water. It's a reminder that, there's no one right way to paint. It's all about finding what works for you and being open to new things.
I never would have thought about using a cloth like that. He even uses masking tape to create clean edges. It's like he's borrowing techniques from other art forms, which I think is really cool.
For sure. What matters is using the right tools and techniques to, achieve your artistic vision. And speaking of vision, Dixon is a huge advocate for observation. He wants us to really look closely at the world around us and see those little details that we often miss.
That's true. We often just rush through life and don't take the time to really appreciate the beauty in everyday things.
He's reminding us that inspiration is everywhere if we just slow down and pay attention. He's also reminding us that, painting is a journey, not a destination. It's about embracing the process, experimenting, and finding your own style.
It's not about being perfect. It's about enjoying the process. I like how he's not afraid to make mistakes or start over if something isn't working. It's really refreshing to see that kind of vulnerability.
He's showing us that it's okay to embrace, like, the messiness of creativity. And that's a powerful message for any artist. It's about letting go of that need to be perfect and finding joy in the journey.
And he always stresses having fun. He even suggests putting on some music, which I think is a great idea.
Totally. It's a good reminder that art shouldn't feel like a chore. It should be an expression of, our creativity and a source of joy. We've covered so much, from mixing colors and using brushes to those deeper ideas of observation and experimentation. But we're not quite done yet.
There's always more to learn. I'm excited to hear what other insights he has in the final stages of his painting process. Okay, we're back and ready to wrap up our deep dive into Alan Dixon's landscape painting tutorial. I'm excited to see how he pulls everything together in these last steps.
It's amazing how just a few final touches can, completely transform a painting.
Yeah.
I noticed he takes his time refining those edges of the trees and grasses. It's like he's sculpting with paint,
Yeah.
giving them that crispness.
It seems like he uses a bunch of different techniques for that.
Yeah, sometimes he uses that dry brush technique to create a kind of hazy effect.
Okay.
Other times it's a small brush to add those tiny details. It's all about that balance between soft and sharp.
And remember how he talked about making those holes in the trees where the light shines through?
Yeah, it's a small detail, but it makes a big difference.
I never would have thought of that.
It breaks up that solid mass of the tree, creates depth and that feeling of light filtering through.
Okay, yeah,
That's what makes them look so real.
right. And I like how he uses that warm light color to outline the trees.
Yeah?
It makes them pop against the cooler background.
It's subtle, but it gives them that three-dimensional look, almost like they're, glowing in the sunlight.
Yeah.
And those little touches of red and orange he
Yeah.
puts in the foreground. So good.
Those little pops of color are a nice touch.
It keeps things from getting too dull. Now, remember how Dixon talks about stepping back, assessing the painting with fresh eyes?
Mm-hmm.
That's something I need to remember to do.
Yeah, it's easy to get lost in the details when you're up close. Got to step back and see the whole thing.
It lets you catch things you might have missed before.
He even said sometimes he has to leave a painting alone for a few days.
Right. That takes some discipline.
That's a true artist, knowing when to step away.
In the end, it's not about perfection. He's more interested in capturing that, feeling of the scene, the way the light hits the landscape, the movement of the grasses, the stillness of the water.
It's about transporting you to that place.
And he does it so well.
Yeah, he does. This whole tutorial has been more than just like a technical how-to. It's about observation, experimentation, enjoying the process.
And the best part, he's encouraging us all to, find our own way.
He's not saying copy me. He's saying learn from me and find your own style.
Exactly. Art is a journey, not a finish line.
This whole deep dive has been so inspiring. I'm ready to grab a brush and just play.
Me too. And remember, it's not about getting it perfect. It's about the joy of creating,
Beautifully said. Until next time, keep exploring, keep creating, and keep diving deep.